So De Soto wasn't the last Spaniard to try to capture parts of the U.S. Southeast or what became the U.S. Southeast in the 16th century. Spain launched a new effort in 1559. And this time they thought maybe we'll take a little bit nicer approach and not be quite so destructive as De Soto had been. And they sent a guy named Tristan de Luna, and he arrived near what's today Pensacola, and he showed up with 1,000 colonists and soldiers and their wives and their missionaries and some Indian captives. And the Pensacola natives remembered who De Soto was, and they took their food with them and ran the heck away. And De Luna continued moving north, and the natives he met further north wanted nothing to do with him. So then he decided, well, I'm going to change my tactic and go De Soto on these people, and he burned down a number of native towns rather than trying to negotiate. Running low on food, De Luna sent a contingent of troops with gifts for the Coosa, who lived in what's now North Georgia, or northwest Georgia, and he wanted to make a deal with the chief of the Coosa to take out the Napachees, who lived in Tennessee, or what's now Tennessee. So even taking the Napache food, though, wasn't enough to feed all the colonists and the soldiers that De Luna had brought with him, so he had to leave the following year in 1560 and go back to Mexico. Another expedition in 1566 came under the command of a guy named Juan Pardo, who was ordered to build some forts that would extend across the Gulf of Mexico. He tried the same kind of tactics to try to extract food from weaker tribes, but the forts he built ended up being useless when the tribes would attack him, and so he also had to withdraw. So even though none of these ridiculously violent expeditions ended up succeeding, which you'd be surprised if they would, they did have a considerable impact on these societies. So most of the tribes that the Spanish countered declined by 75% over about 50 years due to disease. So the Coosa Confederacy, for example, it dissolved and it reorganized into a less centralized grouping of tribes, which the Europeans came to know as the Creeks. Survivors in what's now Alabama regrouped into what was called the Choctaw Confederacy, and they became what Europeans came to know as the Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Catawba Confederacies. And so the names that we're a little bit more familiar with, if you know any of the indigenous history of those areas, those are actually not the groupings that existed, not the communities that existed before contact. Those are communities that were created by contact in a lot of ways. Despite that, the Spanish still tried to repeat the Aztec experience. Different soldiers of fortune trying to accomplish what Cortez had accomplished. A large expedition under the command of another conquistador named Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. He took over 1,000 soldiers and explorers into what's now New Mexico. What they found were Pueblo trading goods and or trading centers with valuable goods, but they never lived up to the expectations that they wanted of gold and all kinds of riches. In the Pueblos they encountered, they would steal the goods of the Pueblos and rape their women. Coronado used a native guide that he called the Turk, who took him into what's today Arizona and as far as into the plains, we think up into Kansas, and searching for these cities of gold that he never discovered. Coronado ended up killing his guide and turned around and went back to Mexico. And so again, none of these efforts to repeat the Aztec experience were successful. There were a number of encounters along the west coast in California. Juan Cabrillo was the European who first met the natives who were called the Ipai, the first California natives to encounter Europeans. They lived around where San Diego is now, and they weren't particularly friendly, knowing that Europeans, having heard already by the mid-1500s, this was in 1542, that Europeans were dangerous, and so they rightly would fight them as soon as they could. Still, though, Spain developed regular trade across the Pacific, and they would thus stop at various places along the west coast and interact with the natives, but left little record. And the west coast was kind of a free-for-all of different European explorers. The Spanish activity drew the attention of an English privateer named Sir Francis Drake, and in 1579 he entered Miwok territory, which is north of what became San Francisco Bay, and he proclaimed it an English colony, and some English disembarked and lived among the Miwoks. They left behind goods that had been found in archaeological digs, and so and it reflects the trade that existed. So they found Chinese goods in those archaeological digs, and so there was trade going on, facilitated by the Spanish, English, and other European ships between natives on the west coast and China and Asia. What the Spanish left behind, though, were profound impacts on the native communities. The trade goods they offered became in-demand items for the native economies, and their shipwrecks left a lot of metal goods for the natives to salvage and trade, and some Europeans that got lost got integrated into the societies. The Spanish and the Portuguese were the most successful in the Americas. The Spanish found in the southeast what was a kind of mini empire, not unlike the Asian polities. So the English thought maybe if they explored further north, they might find bigger empires that they might be able to discover and plunder. And they tried to explore where they thought the Spanish had less influence, and so they went further north, and they landed in what's now Virginia in the 1580s and discovered Algonquin-speaking peoples that had smaller villages that were organized into kind of confederacies or alliances. What these natives didn't have a whole lot of contact with Europeans, and what little they had was violent with the Spanish scouts. So all that changed in 1584 when the English tried to establish a working colony. An English explorer named Arthur Barlow arrived off the banks of what's now Roanoke Island and met the Roanoke Indians. He went back to England, reported to his employer, Sir Walter Raleigh, that the area was rich with goods and the natives so nice and kind that the Englishmen could go there and live without working. Raleigh assumed that that was true, and he dispatched a company of about 100 settlers and sailors to colonize it and live off the natives' free labor. The thinking was, we'll just show up and the natives will work for us. Two educated gentlemen, Thomas Harriot and John White, tried their best to record what they found. So this image on your left here is one of John Wright's engravings of the local natives. But a dispute with a Roanoke chief over a missing cup caused one of the mercenaries, a guy named Richard Grenville, to go berserk and essentially kill a bunch of people and go on a rampage against the village. After that, the Roanokes understandably distrusted the English. The colony had to be abandoned. Raleigh sent John White back 2 years later. This time, John White was ordered to, he was already the more diplomatic of them. He was ordered to be very nice to the natives. It still didn't work out well. And he had to go back to England, and the colony that he left behind was abandoned. It's assumed that the settlers went to live with the local Indians.